I asked my son-in-law when the wedding was, and he said, "We got married yesterday." I remember how the air in the room seemed to thin out, like someone had opened a window in the middle of winter. My coffee went cold in my hand, and all I could hear was the faint hum of the refrigerator behind him. It took a full 3 seconds before I could even blink. "Yesterday?" I repeated as if maybe he'd misspoken. He didn't flinch. He didn't smile. Just stood there on my front porch in that cheap navy suit, the one he wore to every family dinner. Hands in his pockets like nothing had happened. My daughter wasn't with him. No ring on her hand, no photos. No calls, no invitations, no church bells, nothing. Just this man standing in front of me, telling me he had married my daughter in secret. And the worst part? He looked proud. There's a particular kind of silence that only fathers understand, the one that comes right before something in you breaks. I didn't shout. I didn't curse. I just asked quietly, "Where is she?" He said she was resting. Then he said something else, and something I still hear every night when I can't sleep. It was her idea. I didn't even realize I'd sat down until I felt the cold of the wooden chair through my palms. Her idea. Those words hit harder than anything else could. I raised that girl alone after her mother passed in 2003. She was 10 back then, too young to understand why her mother wasn't coming back, but old enough to promise she'd always tell me everything. Every school project, every heartbreak, every dream. And she had kept that promise, or so I thought. The last time she mentioned him, she called him Mark from the firm, said he was helping her transition to a new department. I met him once. Polite handshake, cheap watch, those eyes that measure people before they speak. I didn't like him, but she looked happy, so I kept my opinions to myself. You learn after 50 that sometimes silence feels like love. The next month she grew distant. Cancelled Sunday dinners, sent short texts, said work was killing her. I didn't push. I thought maybe she just needed space. Turns out space was exactly what they wanted. Space to plan a wedding without me. To build a life I was never supposed to be part of. I asked him again, trying to keep my voice steady. "Where is she resting?" He looked past me, eyes flicking toward the street, then said something about needing time to adjust. Adjust to what? Being married? To cutting off her father. I followed his gaze and saw a car idling at the curb. In the passenger seat someone was sitting, head turned away. My chest tightened when I recognized the scarf around her neck. It was the same one I'd bought her last Christmas, still wrapped in the same loose knot. My daughter. I stepped forward, but he shifted slightly, blocking the way with a calmness that felt rehearsed. "She doesn't want to talk right now," he said, tone polite, words sharpened at the edges. "Please respect that. Respect that." I almost laughed. I raised her on my own, watched her fight her way through law school, helped her buy her first car, co-signed the loan for her first apartment, and now I was supposed to respect being shut out of her life like a stranger at the door. My throat burned. "Tell her I'll wait," I said. "However long it takes." He nodded, then walked away without another word, slid into the driver's seat and drove off. The taillights vanished down the hill, and the sound of the engine faded until there was nothing left but the ticking of the wall clock behind me. That night I sat by the window until sunrise, every light in the house turned off, replaying that moment again and again. By morning I decided to find out the truth myself. Because if she truly married that man, she was either in love or in danger. I started with what I knew. My daughter Emily always left traces. She was meticulous with her finances, her calendar, her emails. When she moved in with him 6 months ago, she said it was temporary, something about saving up for a mortgage. I helped her pack boxes that day. I remember labeling them carefully. Kitchen, books, winter clothes. I didn't see it then, but that last box, the one she marked private, she didn't let me carry. Said it was just old paperwork. I found the storage key for her old apartment still on my spare keychain, and by noon I was standing in front of that door again. The place was half empty but not cleaned out, like someone had left in a hurry. A single lamp, some files scattered on the desk, and a small silver frame on the shelf, our photo from her graduation. The glass was cracked across my face. I stood there too long, the air stale with dust and a faint smell of her perfume, when I noticed a thin envelope under the radiator. It was addressed to her workplace, Internal Revenue Department. The postmark said July 9th. That was a week before she stopped answering my calls. Inside a formal letter, A joint tax filing under her name and Mark's. Married officially. No ceremony, no guests, just signatures. My heart sank lower than anger could reach. I sat on the floor reading the numbers. Joint property, shared accounts. Her salary merged into his financial portfolio. Every line screamed control. Then another detail. A transfer authorization signed by her, but the date was the same day she'd been with me at the hospital for my checkup. I remember because she brought me lunch. She couldn't have signed this that day. That's when it hit me. Either he forged her signature or she didn't even know. I spent the next 48 hours digging. Bank statements, linked accounts, old emails. The more I found, the more the puzzle fit together. He'd been adding himself to her accounts piece by piece, using joint filing and investment advice as pretexts. I printed everything out and stacked it on my desk, every page like a punch to the gut. Then, out of nowhere, a call came in from a number I didn't recognize. "Mr. Coleman," a woman's voice said. "I'm calling from Thompson & Reed Legal Associates. Are you aware that your daughter transferred power of attorney to her husband last month?" I felt my pulse in my ears. "No," I said, my voice breaking for the first time in years. "Can you send me that document?" She hesitated, said she wasn't supposed to, but something in her tone softened. "Check your inbox in 5 minutes," she whispered. The email arrived with an attachment, scanned, dated, notarized, his name next to hers. I stared at her shaky signature. It looked off, the letters uneven, rushed. She'd never sign anything like that. That night I sat in my office under the dim light. Papers spread out like a crime scene. For the first time I realized this wasn't about love. This was about ownership. And if my daughter couldn't see it, or wasn't allowed to, then I would. I picked up my phone, opened my contacts, and scrolled to a name I hadn't called in a decade. Daniel Green, attorney at law. When he picked up, his voice sounded the same as it did in 2012, back when we worked on my company's lawsuit. "Coleman?" he said, half laughing. "Didn't expect to hear from you." "I need to talk," I said quietly. "It's about my daughter, and I think her husband's been forging her signature." Daniel didn't ask questions. He just said, "Come by tomorrow at 9. Bring everything." I didn't sleep that night. The streetlight outside flickered through the blinds, and every time I closed my eyes I saw her face in that car, blank, distant, like she was watching herself from somewhere far away. I kept thinking about that scarf. She'd told me once, years ago, that she wore scarves when she felt unsafe, said it made her feel like she had a shield. So I clung to that thought because it meant something was wrong, not gone. At 8:45 the next morning, I was standing in Daniel's office with a folder thick enough to break a stapler. He poured coffee for both of us and said, "Start from the beginning." I laid out every page, every signature, every date. He read in silence for 15 minutes, then looked up. "This isn't just manipulation," he said. "It's fraud." He pulled a separate sheet from his drawer, a power of attorney revocation form. "If that signature isn't hers, we can challenge it. But first we need proof." I nodded, jaw tight. Proof. That word had been echoing in my head since the porch. Daniel gave me a small device, a pen recorder barely thicker than a real pen. "Get him talking," he said. "You don't have to push. Just listen." I took it home, tucked it in my jacket pocket, and waited for a reason to use it. It came sooner than I expected. The next evening, Mark showed up unannounced, the same polite knock, the same calm expression. "Emily wanted me to bring you this," he said, handing me a small box. Inside was my late wife's locket, the one that had been missing for years. My stomach twisted. "Where did you find this?" I asked. "Emily said it was in storage," he replied smoothly. "She thought you might want it back." He was lying. That locket had never left the jewelry box in her room until she moved in with him. I closed the lid and looked at him. "How's she doing?" I asked. He hesitated, then said, "She's fine. She just needs space." I nodded slowly. "And she's okay with all the legal documents." "The joint accounts?" His eyes flickered in just a split second, but enough. "Of course," he said. "She signed everything herself. You can ask her." I kept my voice even. "I will." I let him talk. About their plans, their new life, the investments he was managing for her. Every word went straight into the pen recorder in my pocket. When he finally left, I didn't breathe until his car disappeared down the road. Then I sat in my office and played it back. Every arrogant word, every slip. The next day, Daniel listened and nodded grimly. That's good, he said. Very good. We'll have it transcribed and timestamped. But we'll need something more. Maybe a paper trail. If he's using her money, there will be withdrawals, invoices, maybe even shell accounts. That became my obsession. Every night after work, I traced his movements. He wasn't smart, just confident. There were transfers to a holding company registered under his cousin's name, unexplained cash withdrawals in round numbers, 4,000, 6,000, 8,000. The trail led to a small real estate firm that invested in rental properties, only there were no properties, no tenants, no listings. Just a name, Marbridge Holdings LLC, registered under Mark's address. Daniel called in a favor with an investigator, and within 3 days we had confirmation. The company didn't exist. It was a shell, built to move Emily's money into his private account. I remember standing in Daniel's office when he told me, rain streaking the window behind him. We have enough to open a fraud case, he said. But if she won't cooperate, it's tricky. Then I'll get her, I said. I don't care how. That night I drove to their place, an upscale condo complex with too many security cameras and not enough soul. I parked across the street and waited. At 9:40 the lights in their window went dark except for one lamp. A shadow crossed the blinds, her height, her frame. I wanted to run up there, knock until my hands bled, but I didn't. Instead I sent one text. I know what he did. I can prove it. You don't have to be afraid. I didn't expect her to reply. But 5 minutes later, 3 dots appeared. Then one word. Tomorrow. The next morning I drove to the cafe she mentioned in her text, a quiet place on the edge of town, the kind where the same 5 people read newspapers every morning and no one asks questions. I arrived early, sat in the corner booth and waited. At exactly 9:07, she walked in wearing sunglasses and that same scarf. Her face was thinner, eyes duller, but she was my little girl. For a few seconds, neither of us said anything. When she finally took off the glasses, I saw the faint bruise on her cheekbone hidden under makeup. My hands clenched under the table, but I kept my voice steady. Are you all right? She looked around before answering, her voice barely above a whisper. He said if I talked to you, he'd make it worse. I froze. Worse how? She looked down. Dad, he controls everything. My accounts, my phone, even my car. He made me sign things I didn't understand. He said it was normal, that married couples share everything. But when I wanted to leave, he said I couldn't, that if I did, I'd lose everything, and including my license. Her job as an accountant depended on that license. I could see the fear behind her words, but also shame. He's been taking your money, I said quietly. Not just yours. Your mother's savings, too. Her lips parted, shock mixing with guilt. I didn't know. He told me it was all for taxes. I slid a small envelope across the table. Inside were copies of the documents, highlighted signatures, wire receipts, even the transcript of his lies. Daniel's building a case, I said. We can undo everything if you stand with us. She hesitated, glancing toward the window as if someone might be watching. He checks my messages. He follows me to work sometimes. If he finds out... Her voice trailed off. I leaned forward. Emily, listen to me. You don't have to fight him alone. But I need you to trust me again. That word, trust, hung between us like something fragile and old. She nodded slowly. Okay, she whispered. I'll help. That was the moment the tide turned. We spent the next hour planning carefully. New phone, new email, lawyer-client privilege under Daniel's name. Everything had to look normal. She'd act like nothing had changed while secretly forwarding every new document Mark asked her to sign. For the first time in months, I saw a spark in her eyes again. He won't see it coming, she said, voice trembling but steady. He thinks I'm scared. Let him think that, I said. When she left, she hugged me quickly, then turned away before anyone could notice. That evening, I called Daniel. We're in, I told him. She's ready. What happened next moved faster than either of us expected. Within a week, we had enough evidence to file a preliminary complaint. Forged power of attorney, misappropriation of marital funds, coercion. But before Daniel could submit it, something happened. Emily didn't show up to work one morning. Her supervisor called me worried. No answers, no messages. I drove to her condo. The doorman said they'd left early the previous night, with luggage. He thought they were going on vacation. My stomach dropped. I called every contact I had. every police connection from my old business days. By midnight, I learned they had boarded a flight, not international but out of state. Florida. I booked the next ticket out. During the flight, I couldn't stop staring at her last message. If I don't text by morning, call Daniel. When I landed, I drove straight to the address listed under one of his shell companies, a beach house in Fort Myers, rented under Marbridge Holdings. It was dark except for a single light upstairs. I parked 2 blocks away, walked the rest of the distance, the sound of the waves dulling my heartbeat. Through the window, I saw him pacing with a drink in his hand, phone pressed to his ear. Then I saw her, sitting on the couch, motionless, staring at the floor. I pulled out my phone and recorded a short clip through the glass. Proof she was alive, proof she was trapped. Then I called Daniel. I found them. Daniel's voice on the line was calm but tight. Listen carefully, he said. Don't go in alone. I'm calling the local sheriff's office right now. Stay in your car, keep your lights off, and wait for my call. But I couldn't. Not after seeing her like that, shoulders hunched, body small, like she was trying to disappear into herself. I'd seen that same posture once before, years ago, when she was 8 and her mother's boyfriend yelled at her for spilling juice on the carpet. That same stillness, that same fear, something inside me snapped. I left the phone in my pocket, moved quietly around the side of the house and tried the back door. It was locked, but the old wooden frame gave after one good push. The sound made my pulse spike, but the surf outside covered most of it. I stepped inside. The smell of whiskey and sea air mixed thickly in the dark. I could hear his voice from the living room, low, irritated. You think your dad can fix this? He's nothing without his company. Then a slap. Not loud but sharp enough to make my blood roar in my ears. I stepped forward, and before I could even think, I was in the doorway. He froze mid-sentence, his hand still half raised. She turned first, eyes wide. Dad, she whispered. He backed away a step, setting the glass down with a sneer. Well, he said, tone dripping with mock amusement. Look who finally decided to visit. I didn't answer. I just looked at her, my daughter, and then at the bruises on her arm. Pack your things, I said quietly. We're leaving. He laughed, a sound that didn't belong in any home. You don't get to order anyone around here. She's my wife, my property. The word property made something inside me go cold. I didn't shout. I didn't move fast. I just walked toward the table, where a stack of papers sat, bank statements, wire slips, a passport. His little empire of lies, sitting right there. You forged her signature, I said. On every one of these. He shrugged, still smirking. You think anyone cares? She's of sound mind. She signed everything. No, Emily said suddenly. Her voice trembled but didn't break. I didn't, and I have proof. His smile vanished. She stood, hands shaking but her eyes clear. The emails you told me to delete? I saved them. Every single one. And they're already with my lawyer. He turned to me, fury creeping up his neck. You did this, he spat. I met his glare. No, I said. You did. The front door burst open before he could reply. 2 officers stepped in, guns lowered but ready. Daniel must have called them anyway. Mark's voice went shrill. This is harassment! She's my wife. But she was already walking toward them, her hand clutching the scarf like a flag of surrender and defiance at once. I'm pressing charges, she said. The officer nodded, taking her statement right there. Mark tried to grab her arm, but the other officer restrained him easily. I just stood there watching him curse and struggle, his expensive shirt wrinkled, his face red. He looked smaller than I remembered. By the time they cuffed him and read his rights, he wasn't saying anything anymore. Emily walked to me slowly, her breathing uneven. It's over, she whispered, but I could tell she didn't believe it yet. I put my hand on her shoulder. No, I said. It's just beginning. 2 days later, Daniel called to tell me Mark had been charged with fraud, coercion, and falsifying financial documents. There'd be a trial, maybe even jail time. But more than that, the court had issued a restraining order and frozen all joint assets pending investigation. I thought that would bring peace, but peace doesn't come easy after something like this. Emily moved in with me for a while. The first few nights she barely spoke. She'd sit on the porch with tea, staring at the road, waiting for something that wasn't coming. One night she asked quietly, How did you know? I told her the truth, that I didn't, not really. That a father's gut is just the memory of every time his child ever needed him. She cried then, quietly, like she was letting go of years all at once. We never talked about the slap or the night in the house. We didn't need to. But one evening, she came into my office holding that cracked graduation photo. She'd replaced the glass, cleaned the frame, and set it on my desk. "It's time to stop blaming yourself," she said. I looked at her and realized she wasn't the same girl anymore. She was stronger, quieter maybe, but unbreakable in a new way. And I finally let myself breathe. The trial started 3 months later, in a small county courthouse that smelled of old wood and fresh paint, the kind of place where every creak of a bench carried through the room. Emily insisted on testifying, even though Daniel said she could submit a statement. "I need him to hear it," she told me. "I need to say it to his face." I sat in the second row, hands folded, watching her walk to the stand in a simple navy dress. No makeup this time, no scarf, just her steady and clear. Mark sat across from her with his lawyer, the same smug look, a different suit. He didn't even glance at her. When the prosecutor asked her to describe what happened, her voice didn't shake. She spoke like someone finally cutting through fog, how he'd isolated her, convinced her to merge accounts, used legal jargon to keep her quiet. How the bruises came from control, not anger. Every sentence landed like a nail sealing his fate. I could see the jury leaning forward. Mark's attorney tried to twist her words, but she stayed calm, answering each question with precision. At one point, he held up a page from the so-called joint tax filing, the one with her forged signature, and asked, "Are you saying your husband forced you to sign this?" She met his gaze, then looked straight at Mark. "No," she said softly. "I'm saying he signed it for me." The room went silent. You could almost hear the judge's pen pause mid-note. The prosecutor entered the recording, the one I'd made that night, into evidence. They played it through the speakers, his voice casual, careless, bragging about managing her investments. The jury's expressions hardened one by one. When it ended, Mark finally looked at me. There was no hatred in his eyes anymore, just fear. The kind of fear men feel when they realize they've run out of tricks. After 4 days of testimony, the verdict came back. Guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to 3 years in state prison and ordered to repay every cent he'd taken. Watching the bailiff lead him away, I didn't feel triumph, just quiet relief, and exhaustion so deep it almost hurt to breathe. Outside, the sun was sharp and clean. Emily stood beside me on the courthouse steps, the wind pulling strands of hair across her face. "Is it really over?" she asked. "Legally," I said. "Emotionally, maybe not yet," she nodded. For a while we just stood there, the sound of traffic blending with the courthouse flag snapping above us. That night we ate dinner together, real dinner, not takeout. I cooked her mother's recipe, the one with lemon chicken and roasted vegetables. Halfway through the meal she smiled for the first time in months. "You know," she said, "Mom would have liked Daniel. He reminds me of you." I laughed quietly. "Daniel's got better suits," I said, and she rolled her eyes. That small moment, laughter, plates clinking, the normal rhythm of home, meant more than any verdict ever could. Over the next few weeks, she started living again. Got her job back, changed her number, repainted her old room in pale green. Sometimes I'd hear her humming in the kitchen while she made coffee, like nothing bad had ever happened. But every now and then I'd catch her staring at the window at night, lost in thought. Healing isn't neat. It doesn't arrive all at once. One evening, as I was closing the blinds, she said, "Do you ever think people can change?" I looked at her for a long moment before answering. "They can pretend to, but real change starts after they've lost everything." She nodded, slowly, understanding. In that moment, I realized she'd stopped being just my daughter. She'd become a survivor. And maybe that's what all this was about. Not revenge, not punishment, but freedom. She went back to therapy, started volunteering at a women's shelter. Daniel helped her set up a new trust, one only she controlled. Every detail, every signature, hers alone. The day the last document was signed, she handed me a copy with a small smile. "It's official," she said. "He can't touch me anymore." I framed that page next to her graduation photo. 2 documents, 2 different battles, both proof that she'd earned her life back. And that night, for the first time since all this began, I slept without leaving the light on. Months passed. The world somehow kept spinning. The trial faded into memory. The reporters stopped calling and the house became quiet again. Emily started spending her weekends away. Small trips to the coast, art galleries, bookstores. Every Sunday she came back calmer, lighter. One evening she showed me photos from a local art fair. Sunlight, sea breeze, new faces. I noticed one man in several pictures, a friend from her volunteer group, she said. His name was Chris, an architect who built affordable housing for single mothers. She spoke his name gently, almost cautiously, as if afraid to let hope out too early. I didn't say much, just listened. But inside something in me unclenched. Months later she introduced us. He came over for dinner one evening, brought flowers for her and a bottle of bourbon for me. Quiet guy. Respectful handshake, eyes that didn't dart around the room. When she left to check on dinner, he said, "Sir, I know she's been through a lot. I won't rush anything." That was all I needed to hear. After he left, I found myself smiling at the silence. There was no tension anymore, no shadow hanging over the house. Just peace. But peace has a strange weight when you've lived too long without it. I started noticing things I hadn't in years, the way the morning light hit the photo on my desk, the smell of coffee drifting through the hallway, the sound of her humming again. I began volunteering at the same shelter she worked with, not because I wanted to hover, but because I needed purpose too. Most of the women there were younger than my daughter, all of them carrying stories that sounded too familiar. I didn't talk much, just fixed shelves, repaired locks, built things they needed. But sometimes one of them would ask, "You're Emily's dad, right?" And I'd nod. That alone made the long days worth it. The final hearing came in spring, a restitution review. Mark didn't appear in person, only his lawyer. The court confirmed that all stolen funds had been recovered through asset seizure. His company, Marbridge Holdings, was dissolved. His personal accounts were frozen for 10 more years. Emily didn't even attend. She said she didn't need to see his name again. But I went. I wanted to hear it, officially, legally, that his grip on her was gone. When the judge read the final order, I felt something leave my chest, a pressure that had been there for months. Outside the courthouse, the cherry trees were blooming. I called Emily, told her it was done. She just said, "Thank you, Dad." Later that night, we sat on the porch again, same spot as before, same quiet air. She leaned her head on my shoulder and said, "I used to think strength meant staying no matter what. Now I think it means walking away and not looking back." I didn't reply. I didn't need to. The truth was right there between us, the kind that doesn't need words. A week later, she moved into her own place again, a small apartment overlooking the bay. I helped her carry boxes, same as years ago, but this time she carried most of them herself. When we were done, she hugged me tight and said, "Don't worry, I'm home now." And for the first time I believed her. That night, back in my empty house, I poured myself a drink, sat by the window and thought about everything we'd survived. People talk about revenge like it's fire, something that burns your enemies. But they never mention the light it leaves behind. That steady, quiet glow that tells you you're still here, still alive. I watched the streetlights flicker and realized something simple yet profound. Justice isn't loud. It's the sound of a door closing for the last time. And sometimes that's all a father needs. Summer came, slow and golden, the kind that stretches the evenings long enough to remember what peace feels like. I'd gotten used to the silence, no phone calls from lawyers, no late-night anxiety. Emily's life had filled back up with ordinary things again. Deadlines, laughter, brunches with friends, new furniture arriving piece by piece. I'd visit her on Sundays, always bringing coffee and a box of her favorite pastries. She'd tease me for still wearing the same old jacket, and I'd tease her for finally smiling again. Sometimes Chris was there too, hammering shelves or cooking dinner like he'd always been part of the picture. But I never intruded. I just observed from the edges, grateful that the noise of fear had finally faded into something softer. One evening, I found myself driving down to the same cafe where she'd whispered to me months ago. I sat at the same booth, ordered the same coffee. The waitress recognized me and said, "You look lighter, sir." I smiled. Maybe I am. The truth was I'd started forgiving myself, for not seeing sooner, for staying silent when she needed questions, for thinking love meant letting go entirely. That night I went through my old office drawer, the one still holding all those printed papers, the fake forms, his transfers, her forged signature. I stacked them neatly and placed them in a sealed envelope. Not to forget, but to remember what survival costs. A few weeks later, the county called. Routine update, they said. Mark had applied for early release, claiming good behavior. My pulse didn't even rise. I just said, "Not my problem anymore." The clerk laughed softly and said, "Your daughter's statement alone makes that unlikely." I hung up and went back to sanding the porch railing, the sound of the wood steady and clean. The sun was setting, painting the sky in the same orange she used to call her mother's color. I thought of my wife, how she would have handled all this. She was stronger than I ever gave her credit for. I whispered, "We did it," under my breath. By autumn, Emily invited me to her engagement dinner, a small gathering, just close friends and family. When she stood to make a toast, her hands didn't shake. "I used to think love was safety," she said. "Now I know it's honesty. My father taught me that." Everyone clapped, but I just looked down, fighting the lump in my throat. She caught my eye and mouthed, "Thank you." I raised my glass. After dinner, I stayed to help clean up. She showed me her new office space, simple, bright, overlooking the water. On her desk sat a framed copy of the fraud ruling beside a photo of the two of us. "I keep them together," she said. "One reminds me what I lost. The other reminds me who helped me get it back." Driving home that night, I passed the courthouse one last time. The lights were off, the flag folded for the day. I pulled over for a moment, windows down, and just listened to the crickets and distant waves. All the anger, the sleepless nights, the worry, it had all settled into something quieter now. Not peace exactly, but closure. When I got home, I poured myself a small drink, went out to the porch, and watched the horizon turn silver with moonlight. The world was still imperfect, always would be, but for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel the need to fix it. Emily was free. Justice had done its part, and the house that once echoed with silence now felt like calm instead. Maybe revenge isn't about striking back at all. Maybe it's about outliving the damage, proving that after everything they took, you can still stand, still breathe, still love. And as I sat there with the night stretching around me, I realized something I'd been too tired to see before. This story was never really about him. It was about her, and the kind of strength she taught me just by surviving. Winter came quietly, without drama, just the slow arrival of cold mornings and early sunsets. I'd gotten used to the rhythm of solitude again, the whistle of the kettle, the creak of the floorboards, the radio humming low in the background. My world had narrowed, but not in a bad way. Every day felt earned. Emily called often, sometimes just to talk about work or a new recipe she tried. Sometimes she'd drive over unannounced, bringing groceries or leftover soup, still fussing over whether I was eating right. The kind of small, ordinary love that used to feel impossible. But underneath it all, I could sense she was still healing, still carrying the ghost of control that man had left behind. One night, when the snow was falling hard, she showed up wearing that same scarf, the one from that night, and said she'd finally decided to burn it. I followed her out to the backyard, watched as she dropped it into the fire pit. The fabric curled, darkened, and vanished in seconds. "It doesn't keep me safe anymore," she said. I nodded, not trusting my voice. The flames reflected in her eyes, bright and alive. That was the night I knew she was truly free. Weeks later, Daniel called. The restitution payments had started coming through. "You'll be seeing deposits soon," he said, but I interrupted. "They go to her, not me," he chuckled. "Already arranged. She's rebuilding from scratch. Smart investments, charity work, even mentoring others in similar cases." I smiled. That sounds like her. After we hung up, I walked through the house, noticing how empty it was, but how peaceful too. No more unopened letters. No more fear in every phone call. Just life, simple and unhurried. Then one morning in February, I received a letter. No return address, just my name written in a shaky hand. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a handwritten apology. From him. "I know you'll never forgive me," it said, "but tell her I understand now what I took from both of you." I read it twice, then once more. The handwriting was uneven, smudged, almost desperate. I didn't show it to Emily. I didn't need to. Forgiveness is a strange thing. You can give it silently without letting the other person know. I folded the letter once and placed it in the same envelope as the old documents, sealing the past for good. Spring came early that year. Emily and Chris got married quietly. No guests, no big ceremony. Just a courthouse and a few photos under the blooming magnolias. When she called to tell me, I laughed. "Did you two just decide overnight?" She said, "No secrets this time, just love." It hit me harder than I expected, how far she'd come from that terrified woman hiding behind a scarf. I flew down the next weekend, took them to dinner and watched them talk about paint colors and travel plans. No lies, no tension. Just two people building something honest. But the story didn't end there. A few months later, I got a call from one of the detectives who'd worked our case. "Just wanted you to know," he said. "Your ex-son-in-law got out early on probation." My gut tightened, but he added, "He's not allowed in the state. Parole restrictions. You're both safe." I thanked him and hung up. For a moment, I just stood there, letting the wind blow through the open window. Safe. The word felt real this time. That night, Emily called again, laughing about how Chris had burned the toast for the third morning in a row. We talked until midnight about everything and nothing. Before hanging up, she said, "You know, Dad, sometimes I think maybe everything had to happen for me to learn what love really means." I didn't argue. I just said, "Then it was worth it." After the call, I poured a small drink and sat by the window, same spot as always. Outside, the garden was starting to bloom again, early daffodils pushing through the frost. I thought about how strange life can be, how something so broken can still grow into something whole. I realized then that revenge had never been my true goal. It was protection. It was love disguised as war. And the quiet that followed wasn't emptiness. It was peace finally earned. I don't know what the future holds. Maybe I'll sell the house one day, move closer to her and the grandkids when they come. Maybe I'll stay right here and let the seasons turn. But one thing I know, the fear, the guilt, the sleepless nights, they're behind us now. What remains is a story that no courtroom could ever record. A father who refused to stop, believing that truth would find its way back home. The following year moved like a film. I wasn't quite ready to end, a frame by frame, ordinary, steady, almost gentle. Emily and Chris bought a small house near the coast, a pale blue one with white shutters and a porch swing. She called it the quiet place, and I visited every Sunday, driving 2 hours just to sit with them by the water. She'd bring out coffee. He'd fix something on the grill, and sometimes we wouldn't talk at all. The silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was alive, filled with small things that used to go unnoticed. Seagulls circling above, the rustle of the wind through the dunes, the sound of her laughter echoing against the waves. Every time I looked at her, I saw not the daughter I lost for a while, but the woman who found herself again. Still, there were nights when the old fear crept in. Once she called after midnight, her voice trembling. "Dad, I thought I saw him," she whispered. I told her to lock the doors, turn on the lights, and I drove there without thinking. It was nothing, just a man walking his dog by the street lamp. But when I saw her standing in the doorway, pale and shaking, I realized how deep the scars still ran. I didn't tell her to calm down or to be strong. I just said, "I'm here," and stayed until sunrise. The next morning, as we sat on the porch watching the tide roll in, she said, "It's strange. Sometimes I feel guilty for surviving." I told her, "Surviving isn't guilt. It's proof." She leaned her head against my shoulder, and for a while neither of us spoke. A few months later, I started writing everything down, not to publish, not to share, just to remember. The receipts, the recordings, the court transcripts, but also the moments that came after, the healing, the rebuilding. I wanted her to have something to hold on to when I'm gone, a record that says, "You fought your way out and that matters." Some nights I'd find her old scarf in my desk drawer, the one she didn't burn, the one I kept. I never told her. Maybe I just needed a reminder, not of what happened, but of how far we'd come. Life, for the first time, became almost simple. I took up woodworking again, started building birdhouses for the local park. Emily came by one afternoon with Chris and helped paint them. She laughed when I got paint on my sleeve. "You haven't changed," she said. I smiled. "You have." She stopped, looked at me seriously and said, "Because you taught me to." Then one day a letter arrived, this time from the district clerk. It wasn't about him. It was about her. Commendation for cooperation in a state-level financial abuse investigation. Her testimony had helped pass a new regulation protecting victims from coercive account control. Her name was on it. Emily Coleman, lead witness. I stared at it for a long time. My little girl had turned her pain into change. I called her immediately. She answered on the first ring, laughing as she said, "I knew you'd get that before I could tell you." I didn't even try to hide the pride in my voice. "You did it," I said. You really did. That weekend, the governor's office invited her to a local event to recognize survivors who'd shaped the policy. She asked me to go with her. When they called her name, she walked up the stage in a light grey suit, the same colour as her mother's old coat, and accepted the plaque with steady hands. The applause was long, loud and honest. I felt my throat close, but I didn't cry. She turned toward me and smiled. That same smile from her graduation photo, the one that used to hang cracked and faded. And for the first time I realized the story wasn't about revenge or even survival anymore. It was about transformation. After the ceremony, a journalist asked if she'd like to give a statement. She looked at me first, then said, "People think justice is a destination, but it's not. It's a road you walk one hard step at a time, until one day you realize you're no longer walking toward safety. You're already standing in it." Driving home that night, I watched her through the rearview mirror as she laughed with Chris, wind in her hair, the city lights reflecting off the car window. It hit me then, how close we'd come to losing everything, how fragile and miraculous redemption really is. When I dropped them off, she kissed me on the cheek and whispered, "Go home, Dad, rest, you've done enough fighting." But when I got home, I didn't rest. I sat on the porch with a notebook, the sound of waves faint in the distance, and wrote a single line. You can't protect someone forever, but you can teach them how to protect themselves. I closed it, placed it beside the envelope with all the old documents, and felt something like peace settle in my chest. It wasn't the end yet. But it was the first time I didn't fear what came next. A year later, everything had settled into a kind of rhythm that only people who have lived through storms can appreciate. Emily and Chris had their first child, a girl born in the quiet hours of an early spring morning. They named her Grace after her mother. When Emily called me from the hospital, her voice was soft but steady, the way her mother's used to sound when everything in the world felt right. "Dad," she whispered, "you're a grandfather." I didn't answer at first. My throat locked up, and I just sat there staring at the wall, tears burning behind my eyes. When I finally spoke, my voice cracked. "Is she healthy?" "Perfect," she said, laughing through tears of her own. "She's perfect." The first time I held Grace, she was wrapped in a pale blanket, her tiny hand curling around my finger with impossible strength. Emily watched me smiling and said, "You used to do that with me, remember?" I did remember. I remembered every sleepless night, every school play, every time I thought I'd failed her and somehow hadn't, standing there with that little girl in my arms. I realized that the circle had closed, not broken, not burned, just mended in a way that pain sometimes forces life to be. I whispered to Grace, "You come from strong women and stubborn men. That's the best mix I can think of." Chris took a photo, Emily, the baby, and me, sunlight pouring through the window like some kind of quiet blessing. That picture still sits on my mantel, right beside the old one from her graduation. Two moments that couldn't be more different, but somehow tell the same story. Growth, resilience, hope. In the months that followed, I found myself at their house almost every weekend. The same home by the water, only now filled with baby laughter and the hum of a new life beginning. Emily would hand me Grace and say, "She calms down faster with you." I'd smile and say, "That's because we both like peace." Watching her as a mother was something sacred. She was gentle but firm, the same strength that had carried her through hell now channeled into love. Sometimes I'd see the flicker of the past in her eyes, that momentary fear when the baby cried too long, or when the phone rang late at night. But it would pass quickly, replaced by calm. Healing doesn't erase scars. It teaches you how to live with them. One evening, after putting Grace to bed, Emily sat beside me on the porch. The ocean wind was cool and the sky was fading to orange. "Do you ever think about him?" she asked quietly. I thought for a long moment. "Not often," I said. "And when I do, it's not anger anymore, just distance, like remembering someone else's story." She nodded slowly. "So I think that's what forgiveness feels like." We sat there in silence for a while, watching the horizon. "You know," she said, "when I was in that house, I used to count the minutes until morning. Now I count the waves." I smiled. "That's a better way to measure time." She laughed softly, resting her head on my shoulder like she used to when she was a child. "Thank you," she said, "for not giving up on me." I didn't answer right away. My voice felt too small for what I wanted to say. Finally, I whispered, A father doesn't give up, he waits. That's what we do. A few weeks later, we drove together to a community center in the city. Emily had been asked to speak to a group of young women, survivors of financial and emotional abuse. She asked me to come for support, she said, but I think she wanted me to see what she'd become. I sat in the back while she spoke, her voice steady, her words simple and real. No dramatics, no bitterness, just truth. We think losing control means weakness, she told them, but the real weakness is believing you have to stay quiet to survive. The day I stopped being silent was the day I started living again. The room erupted in applause. Some of the women were crying, others just nodding. I sat there quietly, proud in a way words can't touch. When it ended, she came up to me and smiled. "Well?" she asked. "You spoke like someone who's already forgiven the world," I said. She hugged me tightly. "Maybe I have." On the drive home, she fell asleep in the passenger seat, her head leaning against the window. The highway lights passed over her face, and for the first time in years, she looked completely at peace. I realized then that everything I'd done, the sleepless nights, the legal battles, the anger that nearly hollowed me out, it had all been worth it. Because she was safe, she was free, and that's all I ever wanted. That night, after dropping her off, I drove back to my old house. I sat at the kitchen table, poured myself a drink and stared at the two photos, the one from her graduation and the one from the hospital. Between them lay a whole lifetime of pain, justice, and rebirth. I raised the glass slightly and said to no one in particular, "We made it." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows, but instead of fear, all I felt was calm. It wasn't just that the storm had passed, it was that I'd finally learned how to stand still in the quiet that followed. The years after that seemed to melt together, slow, bright, almost unreal. Grace grew fast, the kind of child who laughed with her whole body, who could turn any ordinary day into something worth remembering. I'd sit on their porch and watch her chase butterflies, her small feet kicking up sand, her giggles echoing over the water. Emily would watch from the steps, sometimes smiling, sometimes quietly lost in thought. There was peace in her now, not the fragile kind that breaks at the first gust of wind, but the kind you build with your own hands after everything else has fallen apart. She opened her own firm 2 years later, specializing in helping victims of financial coercion. Her office walls were lined with photos, not of diplomas or awards, but of the women she'd helped. Survivors like her. Some days she'd call me after work, voice tired but proud, telling me about another client who finally left, another family that got their money back. "It's strange," she said once. "I used to think justice was about punishment, but it's really about making sure no one else goes through what I did." I told her that was the kind of justice that actually mattered. Chris and I grew close too. We'd work on projects around the house together, fixing the deck, repairing the roof, things that men do when they don't know how to say "I love you" out loud. One evening, while sanding a board, he said quietly, "You know, I used to wonder if I could ever live up to her past. Now I just want to make sure I never repeat it." I clapped his shoulder and said, "Then you already have." Time passed, as it always does. I retired from my work, sold my old house and moved closer to them. My new place overlooked the water, small but filled with sunlight. On quiet mornings, Emily and Grace would visit. Grace would climb into my lap, asking me to tell her stories. Not the fairy tales, but the real ones. One day she asked, "Grandpa, were you ever scared?" I smiled and said, "Every day. But being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It just means you keep going anyway." She nodded thoughtfully, far too wise for her age. One evening, after they'd left, I walked out to the porch and watched the sky fade into a deep indigo. The ocean murmured below, steady and calm, like an old friend breathing beside me. I thought about all that had happened, the lies, the betrayal, the trial, the years that nearly broke us, and yet, standing there, I realized the story had never really been about revenge at all. It had been about reclamation, of safety, of dignity, of life. Revenge was just the fire that burned away everything false, so that the truth could finally stand on its own. I pulled out my old notebook, the one where I'd written everything down. On the last page, I wrote a single line. I thought the hardest thing was losing her. I was wrong. The hardest thing was letting her fight her own way back. I closed it gently and placed it on the table beside her old photo. Then I looked out across the water and whispered, "You made it, kid." We both did, The night air was cool and still, carrying the faint laughter of my granddaughter from a few houses down. For the first time, I felt completely unafraid of time passing. The world could turn, the seasons could change, and I would be content. Because even if I wasn't there to see all of it, I knew she'd keep standing, stronger, wiser, freer, and that was enough. So now as I sit here watching the horizon fade into gold, I have one question for you. For anyone who's ever been pushed past the point of breaking, anyone who's ever had to rebuild from ashes, when it finally becomes quiet again, do you let the silence heal you, or do you go looking for another storm?